Okay, so what will you do this week? This week we're going to look at flooding. And so, like some of the other modules and hazards that we've looked at, for flooding, we need a little background. And so, in order to understand flooding, the different types of flooding, and how flooding works, we kind of have to understand how river systems work. And so, the first part of the lecture here that's in the PowerPoint and these, holy crap, lots of little little videos is an introduction to how river systems work. And so we got to know the parts and pieces of rivers, how they evolve, the different types of rivers, because there's different scenarios where we have a couple different types of flooding events that we categorize, and some of that is based on the type of river system we have. So like kind of earthquakes and things like that, we're going to do a little background on river systems before we get into the flooding hazards. But then we will move into the flooding hazards themselves. We'll talk about those. And then, of course, we'll talk about ways to kind of mitigate or reduce the damage that's caused by the flooding events. So don't be horrified by the multiple videos here for the flooding module. I was just trying something a little different, kind of chunking it into smaller pieces. Still covers the information that's in the PowerPoint like the other videos. It's just kind of chunked into different parts for you. So we'll see how that goes. But you can, of course, go through the videos to learn about river systems and flooding hazards. And then I've included a couple little YouTube videos. The two major types of flooding events that we kind of categorize and talk about are what are called flash floods. And so those are usually short duration, kind of fast and furious flood events, something you might see here in Arizona. And then more of what we call regional floods, and these are floods that are a little more long lasting. They impact larger regions and things like that. So these short little clips will give you kind of an example of those two types of flood events. And then for the article here, you can look at this large flood that happened in the Mississippi River. Of course, the Mississippi River is problematic. It is a huge river system, and it's prone to flooding. And a lot of people live in the areas where the floods occur. And so this is an example of one that happened back in 1993, so you can read through that. For the video this week, I'm going to have you watch this Hurricane Katrina video. Now, we typically don't cover hurricanes in this class, although we can, depending on time constraints and things like that. But the reason that I wanted to include it in the flooding section was, one, of course, hurricanes are a hazard, but a lot of the damage and destruction and deaths actually came from not necessarily the wind and some of the features of the hurricane, but actually from the flooding that occurred as a result of that. And so, of course, we know that hurricanes provide lots of rainwater, and so all that water had to go somewhere, so that's part of the flooding issue. But New Orleans has some other issues related to its elevation and how it's situated along the river, and there was some structural failures that occurred that contributed to the flooding. So it's got a lot of components of flooding in it, so that's why I'm going to have you look through that video. And then finally, for the homework. So typically the homeworks have always coincided with what we were talking about that week in the module. This week, I'm going to have you just pick any hazard that you would like to investigate. And so what I want you to do is to find a recent, and we're going to call recent in the past 10 years. So there should be plenty of examples for you to find. I want you to find a recent geologic hazard. And so it can be a volcanic eruption. We know there are some occurring right now. You can look at a recent earthquake that's happened, a landslide event, a flooding event. So any of the things that we talk about in this class is fair game. What I want you to do, though, is I want you to find an article that basically describes what happened. So I don't want you to find a Wikipedia article that summarizes it for you. Now, you can use that to help you complete the assignment, but the main article I want, like, a CNN article or ABC, CBS, some type of article that basically describes what happened, and then you're going to use that to answer some questions about the event. Now, let's be clear, it has to have some significant impact on society. It can't be that there was a small earthquake and no one knew what happened and nothing really happened to anybody. That's not the thing that I want you to investigate, right? We want something that had some major impact on society so that we can talk about it. So your mission is to find that article. Make sure you get me the URL, right? So I need to be able to access it myself. And if you're going to use something else to support it, those articles too. But if you go to the, I'll go to the submission part here. Here's the description and how you're going to complete this assignment. There are 3 parts to it. So you can go through each part, but basically you're going to summarize it. Then you're going to tell me why it was so significant, what caused all the damage and why. Would it happen again? How was the response? You want to relate it to the class. So tell me how this hazard works, right? What are the mechanics behind it? Is there a plate tectonic setting that's happening? Why is there a volcano here? That kind of stuff. And then, of course, I want you to talk about prevention methods. What was used or what could have been used? So I don't always expect that all these answers are coming from your main article. What I expect is that because you've learned something in this class, you can apply that knowledge and say, hey, there was a big earthquake, and even though it specifically doesn't say, this is probably why a lot of people died. There was, problems with building codes or there's high population. You should know that, right? And so you're not necessarily grabbing the information specifically from the article, but you're using your knowledge you've learned in this class to explain the hazard or what happened here. Okay, and look, it doesn't have to be an APA format. I'm not asking for a resource page or anything like that. Answer the questions. If you answer all the parts of the questions, you're golden. So you can bullet list it, you can write it like an essay, however you'd like. Okay, so it's not a formal paper, but basically you need to complete the assignment by answering all the questions there. Okay, that was a lot, but that's the homework. And then for the lab this week, you're also going to look at flooding. And so there is, as always, a little video associated with the lab so that you can kind of get a little walkthrough of what to do in the lab this week. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me.